All right, welcome back to another edition of D Community Conversations. I'm Mike Parker, and this time I'm here with Steven Schveighoffer. And Steve, I've written your name so many times now, I never misspell it anymore.
Makes two of us.
And before we get started, I want to thank Weka. This video is made possible by Weka. Weka is a fast-growing company that's building a cloud and AI native data platform that helps to solve complex data challenges for the world's leading enterprises and preeminent research organizations. Weka is a great place to work for developers looking to sharpen their decoding skills and work on really interesting use cases. So, thanks to Weka. And I have yet to have a Weka employee on the community conversations. You're definitely not a Weka employee.
Not yet.
Not yet. Uh-oh.
No, there's nothing going on.
Yeah, so we are, of course, going to get to your D career, and we've got a good bit to talk about because you've been around the D community almost as long as I have, which I had completely forgotten about until I went back and watched our conversation from DConf Online 2020. You've done 2 DConf Online editions, and in the Q&A discussions, we never actually talked about your origin story. So why don't you get us into that? Where did that all come from? Were you a child? Were you a teenager? What? When did it start?
So I actually thought about this before the interview so that I could have this kind of in my mind. And I'm pretty sure that the first thing I ever did was, I don't know if you ever remember a programming system called Logo.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It was like this little triangle that was called the turtle, and you would move it around and you could either draw lines or not draw lines. And that was, it's not exactly a full-blown, like you're not doing if statements or functions or anything like that. It's just like write commands to make this thing draw around the screen. And I used to play around with that a lot when I was, I'd say like, grade school, 8, 9, or something like that, right? And so that was like kind of like my first introduction to programming. Then I moved on to BASIC. My parents bought us a Commodore 64, I think when I was like 10 or 11 or something like that. And one of the conditions was I was supposed to learn how to type. They bought like some typing tutor things. And also, before we could play games on it. And then I also tried doing some programming with the BASIC that's in there, and nothing really special. There was a lot of cool stuff you could do. Like if you actually wanted to make games, there was some really nice features on there, but I didn't know about them. I just basically made stupid little demonstration programs or whatever that didn't do much other than, maybe asked a couple of input questions and then printed stuff out. But it was interesting, but I realized I wasn't really into programming. Like it wasn't like a focus of mine, I think in high school, I did some programming with like Apple Basic or something like that. That was really boring. We basically spent a lot of time writing out our programs on paper and then running them on paper. So you'd basically write down, this is what I think, the state of the program will be after this line runs. And you were graded on that. And I was like, this is kind of boring and easy. And in high school, I didn't do much programming. I was more into physics. So I had a lot of good experience. I was pretty good at math and physics. My physics teacher was amazing. So I ended up going into college. Oh, and I also had a summer class that I did at MIT, which one of the things you could do is, programming. And I selected, that was my first exposure to C. And I actually got to sit in like the Athena labs where like X Windows was created. And that was pretty interesting. But yeah, that was also like, I didn't know what was going on too much, but, enjoyed it. And then when I went to college at WPI, I was a physics major. And I learned that I didn't really like physics that much. It was just more like the teacher that I had in high school. So I was doing all right in it, but it wasn't really the most fun thing that I thought it was going to be. And I ended up taking a like programming 101 class in Fortran, and like all the people in my dorm who were in the class with me, some of them were, computer science majors. I was like tutoring them on how to do things. And they were like, what are you doing as a physics major? You should be, computer science. And so then I switched and ended up getting a bachelor's degree in computer science. And then, yeah, that's how I got my start programming.
I didn't expect to hear that you were a physics major initially, but how many physics majors or former physics majors do we have in the D community? I mean, we've got a few of them. Yeah,
I think it's common actually, because I think it's closely related. It's like a lot of logic and math and stuff is all related there. And I mean, think about computer games with physics engines. It helps to understand like exactly how that stuff works.
So after college, what did you jump straight into the workforce as a programmer, or was there?
Yeah, at WPI, there was a program where you could take a term and go work for a company. It's like a co-op program, and you basically get class credit for it, and you, it's nice you get to make some money. But I did that for 2 companies. It was both a great experience. I'd highly recommend to anyone who's, looking into that stuff, looking into college, to find a program that has a co-op or internship thing that they sponsor. It's really nice. But the second company I worked for, when I graduated, I basically already had a job there, So it was nice to get out there, go right into working. And that was a fun time. I did a lot of stuff. I did at that company. I did X Windows. We were building a collaborative video system, and we had an in-house MPEG-2 decoder, which is a big deal. And that collaborative video system needed, some X Windows widget that didn't exist. So I actually ended up making an X Windows widget. Learned a lot about object-oriented programming, because X widget toolkit, it's XWT or something, and it was actually Motif at the time. That's all object-oriented in C.
Right.
So you're handling all the different things that a language would normally handle, like virtual functions, all that stuff, manually. I thought that was very interesting, because I got to kind of learn how, mechanically how object-oriented programming works. From there, I worked there for about a year and a half, and then moved to another company that was building distributed web services. So like a load balancing web server type thing. And there I was working on a device that it was the maintenance device. So a lot of people are maybe familiar with IPMI, which is like it's like a system that manages the hardware for you. Like you can talk to it, you can ask it, what's the temperature of the CPU, those kinds of things. And we had a custom built solution before that ever existed, that these devices were 8-bit devices with 256 bytes of RAM, including stack, and 8K of code space. So you had to do all your stuff in that. And that was pretty interesting to work on a little device. Like going from X Windows to that was pretty interesting.
And all of this was in C?
Yeah. At my first company, the thing was in C and C++. So there was some C++ and some C. Back then, there was like really no standard template library, and templates were like this new thing. So none of us understood it, and I think we ended up ripping out a bunch of the template stuff, which is pretty funny since like today I'm very into templates.
So then we're talking about mid to late 90s here.
Yeah.
On the timeline.
Yeah, I graduated in 98.
Uh-huh.
So, this is the early days of that kind of stuff. And then at the new company with the little microprocessor, that was C, like a custom C compiler from ST Micro. And that was interesting too, because, you're not working with this compiler that is used by everyone around the world. It's just like this custom compiler that I think it was a modified version of GCC possibly, but it was specific to their chip. And occasionally it would just output the most insane garbage. Especially like if you were doing anything with 16-bit math on this, you have a 8-bit processor, but the address space was 16 bits. So if you wanted to use
near pointers or far pointers, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. You're dealing with pointers. Anytime you were like adding one to a pointer, it was like, this many instructions, to do that. Is like, so you had to watch what the thing would output. And sometimes you could end up with like this giant list of assembly. I always learned to like disassemble my stuff to see what it would do, because sometimes you just change it around a little bit, maybe break it into two expressions, and the assembly got like down to two instructions instead. So that was another interesting experience with that little processor.
Yeah, and that was kind of common back then too, having to disassemble, and people probably don't get into that so much these days. Early in their careers, I would guess.
So. I think you don't worry too much about it, or even if I disassemble any of my stuff, I barely understand what it's doing. Anyway.
So then, okay, so I know you first got into D around 2007. Yeah. So what about that gap there between that first job and first discovering D? Any big stuff happen in between there? Any other languages you used?
So, I don't know if there was too much. Like, it was mostly C and C++.
Uh-huh.
I knew Java. I learned Java. So I for a while in the early 2000s, I was doing some competitive programming for an online site called Top Coder. It's still there. I think they still do competitive program. But I ended up doing a bunch of problem sets where I would create problem sets for people to solve that were used in matches. That was like at the early time, you actually got money for winning those competitions. Like, it was free to play them, and then you would, the top 3 people would get, a decent, like $100 or something. It was pretty interesting. But their whole game plan was to create this whole community to then like pre-screen applicants for programming jobs, right? So you basically could say, okay, I need someone whose skills are this, and they would look through the problems that you'd solved well and say, okay, well, this person already has, these kinds of skills. So that was what they're basically paying for. I believe they started with Java, and then they added C++. Obviously, I didn't do it until C++ was there. They added C# and Visual Basic.net. So I played around with some different things. Definitely did some Visual Basic. I ended up doing a lot of stuff in C# for that same company where I was working on the little chip. Later on, the project that actually got me into D was this. We kind of morphed from a company that built these load balancing appliances to a company that just built generic appliances for other people. So one of the tasks we had to do was burn in all these devices and make sure that they were, good sound, the memory was fine, all that stuff, to do like 24 hours stress test on them. And so we had people manually doing these things on these systems. They would like have a rack of like 10 units at a time. And what we decided to do is build an automated system that could direct these systems to, boot to this image, run mem test, don't boot to this other image, and run a stress test and all that stuff. And I did the server and the client to run those things all in C#. One of the reasons I did that is Microsoft had a technology that it already had a way to say, reboot this system, re-image it with this thing, run this process on the rebooted system. All that was all handled for us. We just had to connect to it from like COM. So C# was a pretty natural fit for that. And eventually they discontinued that service. So we had to come up with our own thing, and making the agent or the thing that would run. It's like you log in and say, okay, run this stress test. Give me all the output. That was all handled by this Microsoft service that went away. So I had to write my own remote agent, and was looking at the prospect of doing it in C or C++. And I was like, oh, this is gonna be terrible, because I didn't really like the way sockets are, and all the different gotchas, and the code just looks terrible. I'd already experienced C# and Java and stuff like that. I was like, the experience with networking is so much better there, and I didn't want to have to install Java on everything or whatever. So I looked for something better than C or C++, and that's when I came across D.
All right. Then how did you stumble onto it? I mean, you obviously weren't searching for D.
Nope, I wasn't. I was searching for, I don't know if my exact term was, there's got to be something better than C. But that was the gist of what I was looking for. Something better than C but still like native compiled.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I came across D at that point, and I can't remember exactly where I saw it, but I was like, okay, I'll try this. Downloaded it, and I actually didn't like it. So this was D1, and in 2007, so I downloaded, the compiler, and the networking stuff was pretty bare. The most bare thing that I was like, no, I can't deal with this, was process handling. So I think an STD process is still there. If you look at the Phobos from version 1, I think it has like exec, and that's it, like something that execute, and there was no pipes, nothing where I could say, okay, give me the results of these. So it's like, I can't use this. It's not good enough. I might as well use C at this point, right? And then I found out, I think through IRC or chatting with somebody, that said, oh, there's this other library called Tango, which just came out. Like, I looked at the history, that it just had been announced in, I think, January of 2007.
2007, yeah.
Yeah. So I downloaded that, and that was just amazing. It was like a lot more familiar to me, a lot more features for networking processes, stuff like that. So that was where I first started. Like, okay, I could use this, and I built my agent based on that, and it worked really well. One thing that was nice is I ended up having to build my own mini operating system, so that could remote boot and install an image or something like that, because I had to take over all those features. So I ended up with a Linux kernel, BusyBox, and all the network drivers that possibly could exist. And then I needed an agent to run on there, and it's like, okay, well, I have this agent that I'm going to build for everything, and it has almost no depend. It just basically depends on libc. So that was one thing that was really nice. Like, everything was statically linked. There was no run. It worked really well.
So if not for Tango, you would not be a D user today, probably.
No, definitely not.
That's
I would have looked elsewhere. Probably would have stumbled on Python or something else. Or maybe I just would have bit the bullet and did C or C++.
If we jump ahead just a little bit, it wasn't long until you put out what I believe was your first library in D, open source library for people to use, and that was dcollections. Mm-hmm. That was your first one, right? Yeah, that was. And I just went back. I went through the. Vladimir Panteleev has dsource.org archived on read-only setup, and the repository was set up on April 20th of 2008, and your first check-in was the next day. So I didn't realize it was that long ago. So I wonder then, what motivated that? Because Tango already had a collections package.
Interestingly enough, it was that same project. So one of the things that I wanted was the ability. So you could, back then we didn't have like ranges. We just had op-apply. So when I would loop through all my process, okay, I have this agent, it's running a process, it's running X number of processes. I need to loop through all of them and see where they are. And if they're done, then I need to remove them from the list. I didn't like the fact that I had to do that and then go back through and remove them in a separate loop. What I was really looking for with my experience with C++ and like std vector was I just want an iterator where I can point at things and check them and then remove them from the thing and then just go to the next iterator, right? You can do that with C++, no problem. But with, D and Tango, you couldn't do that with those collections. So I kind of wanted a container library that had iterator-like support, because that's what I was used to. And so I built one, and I think, I want to say it was like I worked on it nonstop for like 2 weeks, like at night. It was just kept writing itself almost. It was really, really fun. Yeah, I ended up proposing that actually for Tango, but they didn't want it because the main Tango guy was secretly building his own like replacement container library for Tango. So they didn't end up accepting that. But then so I just released it on its own. It ended up being the first container library for D2 because before std container existed, I just ported it to D2 because now I was using D2 at that point.
Did you add support for ranges?
I did. Yeah, that was a very fun little experiment, I think. So I added support for ranges, and then at the time I released it. I think Andre said, "Oh, we can't accept this because it's got iterators, and we don't like iterators, are not safe." So I was like, "Okay, well, what can I do to?" Because I kind of wanted it to go into Phobos at that point as well. I thought of a concept of a range that is an iterator, or a range that's just basically a pointer. Mm-hmm. And I called it a cursor. Instead of, having a range that says, okay, here's this set of elements. Here's one or no element, and it's just got a pointer to it. And then you can use those cursors to do things like, okay, I want to remove this element. Because remember, this is the whole point of my thing, is I want to be able to remove things while I'm iterating them or at a later time or whatever, So I need pointers to single elements. That concept actually, I think, is pretty solid.
It didn't go over well, right?
Yeah, it wasn't accepted into.
Yeah.
Although I did change, I did put the red black tree implementation that I made into Phobos.
Well, the next big project that I'm aware of, and you've told me before, this was probably your most interesting one, was IOPipe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But was there anything? Did you put out anything between dcollections and IOPipes? Because IOPipes was like 2016 when it was first released. Did you?
I don't think I had any personal projects that were. I'd have to look.
All right, but you did do an overhaul of the array implementation at some point in there,
yes,
right? In Phobos or in D runtime.
Yeah, that was around 2013 or maybe even earlier than that. No, I think it was earlier than that. So we had this problem in D1 and early D2 where if you had an array and you just set the length to 0 and then you appended to that array, it would just overwrite whatever data was there. And this was a nice feature because if you wanted to like reuse a buffer, then you would basically write to that buffer and say, okay, now I'm going to set the length to 0 and reuse that buffer again. And it wouldn't reallocate. Like you could append right into that buffer without having it reallocate. This was no good for D2 because you have immutable data and you can't just you overwrite immutable data that way. So they were going to split the type of an array from a T array. And I think the syntax was T open bracket new close bracket, which would have been basically changing. You'd have to remember, is this an is this an appendable array or is this just a slice? So slicing and arrays would become two separate types. And I really wasn't keen on that. I'm like, this is going to stink, to have to keep track of these two different types. So it works really great right now. One of the ideas I had is like, well, why are we doing this thing where we stomp on the memory? Well, the reason we did it is because to determine whether it could be able to append was whether it was pointing at the start of the memory block. Okay, so if you sliced somewhere in the middle and then try to append, it would reallocate. And now you have a new memory block, and now you can append to that block. The real way to do this is to remember how much data has actually been allocated and only allow appending when your slice ends at the end of the allocated data. So I came up with this. I think, I don't know if I was even the first one to come up with that idea, but I definitely was the first one to implement it. that was a very interesting experience because I didn't know anything about garbage collection or how the garbage collector works. And I had to learn all that stuff to add that feature. But what ended up happening is then we didn't have to change any syntax or any code at all. It just, worked in place, and it actually worked better than before. But yeah, that was fun. I would say IOPipe was an interesting library, but that was probably my biggest contribution to D so far.
Right. So your first DConf was like mine, 2013, yes?
Yep.
And I'm wondering, did you submit anything to that? I know you didn't speak. Okay.
I did submit. Yeah. At the time, I was not really doing much with D. Like I was not using D in except for that, that agent or whatever that I was working on. But that didn't really need a lot of maintenance. I wasn't really paying too much attention to the community. I think Andre sent an email out to a bunch of people who are past contributors saying, hey, we need speakers to speak at this conference. I think I did. If you remember, there was actually a Kickstarter campaign.
Yes.
To get that first conference to happen. And I did contribute to the Kickstarter campaign and I think I contributed at a t-shirt level or whatever it was.
I contributed a little bit too. I think as I remember, Facebook said, if you can raise this much money through Kickstarter, we'll fund the rest of it or something like that. So.
Right. So I had already done that, but I just was like, yeah, whatever. And then Andre sent out the message saying, oh, we really, we're desperate for speakers. So, do you think you could come up with something? And I was like, yeah, I think I could come up with something. So I think I submitted like 2 or 3 ideas, and he must have sent it out to a bunch of people because everyone, they ended up saying, okay, we don't need you now because we have. But it got me looking at the conference, and then I'm from Southern California, like I was born in Southern California, and I live in Massachusetts now, have for, over, I think 35 years or whatever. But I have family in Southern California, and we ended up happening to be visiting them during the conference. Me and my family were out there. I think my son was 3 at the time. My oldest son, my youngest son was must have been 1. And so we're out there visiting my aunt, and I was like, well, maybe I can just fly up to San Francisco for the conference, and maybe I'll do it. So I ended up doing that. I ended up saying, okay, well, I'll just take a short flight up and attend that conference. And then I was hooked. Like as soon as that was really, really a great conference. I enjoyed everything about it.
It was tiny, but gosh, it was fun. And it was awesome meeting all these people. And by the way, I've got some pictures from there I didn't take them. Andre had hired a photographer to go around and take pictures. And so I've got some of those photos, which I'm going to put up here. So we'll see our younger selves in this thing. Your first talk at DConf was 2016.
Correct.
And IOPipe was 2017, I think.
Right.
Or was it? Yeah.
IOPipe was 2017 that I did the talk for. But I did submit the talk in 2016 for either IOPipe or the one that I did, which was a talk on mutability modifiers, and specifically, talking about in-out. I think that's another thing that that I contributed, or I don't know if you'd say contributed or inflicted onto the D community was the in-out modifier, because I think a lot of people don't like that modifier. It's really nice when it works, but when it doesn't work, it's very confusing.
Well, tell me about IOPipe then. What motivated that? What got it started?
What got that started was, I think I don't remember exactly why I started working on that, but I think I was just fed up with some of if you look at the code in std.io and what we're doing in there, it's just a complete hack job. Everything in there is using non-standard functions, undocumented functions in the case of like DMC and things like that. It's just to get it to perform decently. And we're talking about everything in stdio is depending on libc. And from Tango, I knew that was not necessary, because all of Tango's stuff did not depend on, obviously it depended on libc for the system calls, but not for the buffered IO. All the buffered IO was done within D, and it worked really well. Like it was a decent system, and fast. So I was just like, why do we have to deal with all these vagaries of C? We should have something that's easier. And I liked the idea of using the buffering that you were already having to do to make IO faster and just directly accessing it. I felt like that would be a huge win in terms of performance, because you wouldn't have to, something that people do all the time is we have this buffer, this stream is being buffered because we need it for the performance. You don't want to read 1 byte from a disk, right? You want to read a big chunk of it, or even from the network. I don't want to pull 1 byte off the kernel buffer because that's costly to go into the kernel. The buffering is done just specifically for performance, but the interface is still a byte stream, right? You're still reading a byte at it. Like if you look at, file star APIs, it's like, get character, get me another character. And the buffering is supposed to alleviate that, but it's like, why not just give access directly to the buffer, and use that for your API? And that's what IOPipe is. It's like, a piece of that is that, and then the I think the more important piece is, building blocks on top of each other, kind of like ranges, where you can build a whole stream based on that. And I think the API needs a lot of user experience improvements, but in terms of performance and what you get for it, it's really good. The compiler has full access to everything, the optimizer. So, I think I demonstrated that in my talk in 2017, that like with not too much effort, I could match the performance of like some really good existing like JSON libraries or whatever.
Yeah. And that talk stood out. I mean, I still remember that talk, and I still remember you talking about Windows, and not the operating system, but the buffer window. And I still remember the JSON parser that you had, and everybody was blown away by how fast it was, as I recall at the conference. So that talk stands out in my mind. Is that JSON? Did you ever release that JSON library?
Yeah, there's a package on Dub called JSON IOPipe. Actually, people who use it, because I'll get like, pull requests or bug reports or whatever on it.
Your next DConf talk was about vibe-d, 2018 in Munich.
Yeah.
How to convert your rusty old lamp into a shiny new Vibe app. So where did you start getting into Vibe?
That was interesting. So I really, really liked Vladimir Panteliv's talk in, I think it was 2013.
Yeah.
On how Vibe works, and I was lamenting that. I think it was to Andre. I said, well, I can't use it because I have this already existing system that uses PHP and, LAMP, basically Linux. What is it? Linux, Apache, MySQL. Yeah. So this was the system I was using. I kind of inherited that system, but I'd done a lot of work on it, but it's like, I can't, just throw away that whole thing and start over. And he said, well, why not? Why can't you just do it a piece at a time? And I said, well, I guess I could do that, because it is a web server. You can move one page over at a time or whatever, but it's like, I don't know if I can get that to work. And I thought about it for a while, and then I was like, I think I can do this. I think it's something that I'd like to work on. And at the time I was working for my family's company, and the application I'm talking about is just an internal like tracking system, not a public facing system. So, I said, I think I could get a lot more productive or better, make it easier to add new features if I switch to using Vibe-d. And so I've been working on it I'm still working on it, which is maybe a disapproval of that theory. I don't know. But yeah, so adding new things now to that system is actually pretty straightforward, and it's much more enjoyable for sure than having to work on PHP. But yeah, that was my talk on that translation.
So then the next DConf, in our first one in London in 2019, now I did not remember the topic of this one. I had to look it up. But I do remember that you were interrupted by the fire drill that happened in the middle of the talk. That was unexpected. But yeah, I have since looked up the talk, and that was about serialization.
Right.
So how did that come about?
The talk is kind of a Trojan horse of like, it's not exactly about serialization. That was just kind of like how I get you into it. Mm-hmm. But really the talk is about using the decompiler to write your code for you, like basically a metaprogramming talk. The way I kind of approached it was like, I think there's a lot of people in the D community who have written a serialization library. And the reason you end up writing it is because it's so easy to do, because D just gives you all the tools to do it very, very straightforward. Mm-hmm. And so I looked at some of the reasons why that is. And it all boils down to, you have this super powered compiler that can write all this code for you and basically stand in for what you would have done, write the code that you would have written, but without making mistakes. We should always be using that if you can. And D makes it really easy to do metaprogramming. It's just a talk about, exploring that concept.
Somewhere around this time period, you took over mysql binding?
I don't remember when that was. So the original author, I think his name was Steve Teal. He wanted to build a MySQL library. And one of the things that was happening around that time was Oracle was being very, lawsuit happy about their license for MySQL. Basically, if you use the MySQL library that was open source, your code had to be GPL. Then you could pay for a professional license, and then you wouldn't have that encumbrance. But the protocol was published as a document, so you could actually write your own, library. Mm. And I think we were having conversations about that, and convinced him, do it this way. Just read. Don't try and port the existing library. Just read this document and
do a clean room implementation.
Yeah. And he did that, and then it just kept, getting passed around. I think it was passed around at least twice before it got to Nick Soblowski, and then he was maintaining and did a very good job. And I wanted to make, I think, MySQL safe, because it was like I was starting to get, warnings in my Vibe application. Hey, pretty soon we're going to require that this, your REST implementation has to be safe. And I'm like, this kind of makes sense, because safety is important for a server system. That's where you get all the attacks and everything. So I wanted to look into what needs to happen in order to make this safe. And so I built a PR for this and tested it and figured out how to build, convert this thing to safe. It was probably, it was over a year that the PR was open. And, I'd been changing and talking with Nick and everything, but eventually it kind of trailed off. No contact for a while. And I would occasionally ping, it's like, where are we on this? And then he just says, at one day, which is kind of crazy, but he said, I just can't bring myself to program anymore. So here, I was like, I don't know how you would do that, because I'd be I don't know what I'd do for a living if I didn't have programming. So he must have another job that's not programming related. So that's how I kind of inherited that. I have a lot of thoughts on how to improve that library, but I haven't had a lot of time to work on it.
I see. And then the hits just keep coming. The big one you're working on now is your D raylib Well, raylib,
Yeah.
as people call it. It's a library, not a library, so raylib, I call it. And you did do a talk related to that last year.
Yeah,
you talk about C from D. So just a short description of how you got into that one. And for those, raylib is a C library for doing 3D and 2D graphics with OpenGL through a very simplified interface.
Yes. It's a library built for learning how to do games programming. And I think if you watch some of Rayson, I can't remember his exact name, but that's his handle. But if you watch some of his videos on how he got into that, I think it was more for people who aren't into programming but are into like game design, like art people, or media people. So the reason I got into it is because my son and some of his friends were always begging me to make a coding class for we homeschool our kids, and they were looking for a coding class, and I said, well, what can I do that's fun to do? So I did JavaScript, and then I switched to D. Actually, I wanted to have some kind of a gaming aspect to it because kids are into games. So I looked around, and some guy had done a whole YouTube series on how to use D to make games with raylib. Yeah, so I just started using it, and it worked out pretty well. I think the second year, or maybe even the second part of the year that I was doing this, the guy who put up this raylib binding that I was using just deleted his whole GitHub account without any explanation. And all the attempts that I had to reach out to this guy, that I could figure it out, his email address from like the Git commit history, but never responded. Luckily, I think it was Dennis. No, it wasn't Dennis. It was Jan, who just basically had a copy of all the repositories that are on Dub locally. So he just sent me the repository, and I uploaded into my account, and then we moved the pointer over on Dub, and now I'm the maintainer of that binding as well.
Well, aren't you doing a porting project too?
Yeah, so that came about because with my experience with showing the kids how to properly link to raylib and use it, it was just such a bad process. I've gotten a lot better now. I have a whole script that you can run to make sure your Dub file is correct and that the library you want is correct. But I was like, this should just be as easy as Dub add raylib, and that's it. You shouldn't have to do anything else. I think most programming languages that have those kinds of bindings are like that, where you don't have to do all kinds of extra steps. So I was hoping to port raylib to D to alleviate that concern. Plus, there's some things that the raylib author refuses to add, like all raylib string functions use C strings. And as you know, C strings require appending a 0 byte to the end of everything. When you're building strings in D, you don't want to have to do that. So, but he refuses to add an overload for those functions that takes a length as well as the pointer. That's kind of the impetus for me wanting to port this to D. And once it's in D, I'm hoping to change the APIs to be more D-like as well.
Okay. So you've got all these libraries under your belt. You've got the two major contributions in the form of the array overhaul plus in-out. And then you get this, your most recent contribution was implementing static initialization of associative arrays. Or was there anything in between all of that?
So there's that, yes. But one of the things that I did do, which probably people don't know about too much, is the static constructor runtime. So the thing that runs your static this or your shared static this, that was broken. So the algorithm for sorting those constructors was not correct. So you get into cases where you would, depending on the order that you link to object files, things could be run out of order. And so I fixed that. But in fixing that, it broke a bunch of existing code. I think we had a deprecation period for a while where, and a D runtime switch where you could say, okay, run with the run with the correct algorithm. If it or use the deprecated algorithm. So but that was actually a quite computer sciencey interesting problem on how to sort. Basically graph sorting, but with some extra twist to it. Associative array initialization was almost like a trivial thing, it seems like.
Well, it seems like a trivial thing, but it was a big deal because it was an issue that had plagued us forever. And if I'm not mistaken, this came up after you started joining us for the monthly meetings, right? Didn't it come up in one of the meetings? And
I think it came up actually. So I'm a moderator on the D Discord, and I think it just was so many times that people would say, like, why doesn't this work?
So it was just frustration. Yeah. You were like, let's fix this.
I was like, all we have to do, like, we have been trying to kind of get out of that old associative array implementation, which uses all runtime features for a long time. And I was like, if I make I'll just take a red-black tree and I'll make one at compile time, and it works. Like, it works exactly the same. So I'm like, why can't we do this with associative arrays? And so I just took the associative array implementation, which I was familiar with, and wrote a user library that did that. And, it didn't have all the features of associative arrays, but you could use it. You could build it at compile time and use it at runtime, and it worked fine. So I was like, it's obviously possible for the compiler to do that. And so I proposed it, and I built kind of a simple thing that just built associators. It's like you couldn't use it, but with the library that I made. But the whole point is to make it so it is binary, exactly the same binary representation that you would have during runtime. Because that was the big thing. CTFE associative arrays are not runtime associative arrays. They're not even the same structure. And that's why you couldn't just use them. So I needed somebody who was smart in compilers, in the decompiler, to take the piece that I could build at compile time and just pretend it was an associative array pointer. And that was Dennis. So he did most of the magic. My stuff was just like, I just took the implementation and copied it.
Dennis Corporal.
Yeah, Dennis Corporal. Yeah.
I wonder, like I said, this one was a big deal because it had been a persistent problem for a long time. And like you said, that's what got you, motivated you to fix it. And this is one of those things you see in the change log, and you do a little happy dance at your desk because you're just like, oh, we finally got this fixed. But you mentioned that static constructor thing as the most, as a very interesting computer science problem. So out of all of these features that you've contributed to language, would you say that was the one you're most proud of, or that really?
No, I think the array runtime is way more influential, and probably that one was really nice. So
you're saying you peaked early?
Yeah, I peaked earlier.
Your best days are behind you.
Yes. Who knows? Well, I'm working on a GC project,
and that's my next question. So you and Amaury Sechet are giving a talk at DConf this year about your collaboration on getting his I guess it's the garbage collector he's been working on for the what do they call it now? Is it still the silly decompiler? SDC?
It used to be called the stupid decompiler.
Yeah.
But I think for political correctness, they've switched it to snazzy decompiler.
Snazzy, that's what it is. Okay. So SDC, Amaury's working on this GC, and you and he are working on porting it over to D runtime.
Not exactly. So what we're working on doing is incorporating it, making it so it can be used from D runtime.
I see. Yeah, but you're giving it a D. Okay. Well, you're giving it a D runtime interface.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the, right now it's built in SDC. It's built by SDC,
Mhm.
And eventually the plan is to have it so that it's part of the D runtime proper. So it's just another alternative GC you can use. And that's a little bit of a longer way off, because STC, I'm learning as I'm working on this, is not exactly the same language as normal D. So there's different little quirks that you have to deal with. It's very close, but it's like, you'd have to tweak a lot of things. So we would probably have to port that before it's like ready. But for now, we have a complete extrinc interface that, and I'm able to run I tested it the other day. I'm able to run like a Vibe-D app with the STC garbage collector. So it's working. And yeah, we're in process of doing that.
All right. I'm looking forward to the talk. I think it's going to be a really, really interesting thing to watch.
There's a lot of really interesting concepts and features in there.
Yeah. And I say the talk, it's actually 2 talks you guys are doing over 2 separate days. Yeah. So we're looking forward to those. And this is going to be I counted them up because I was talking to Robert, and I was telling Robert before, I think he probably has more DConf talks than anyone else other than Walter. But now I'm not so sure, because I've counted up yours. This is going to be your 6th DConf talk. I haven't counted his yet. Plus, you've also got 2 DConf online talks. What motivates you to give these talks? I've got one. I've given 1 talk the whole time. I've submitted 2.
Yeah. So, interestingly, the very first talk that I gave, part of what motivated was like I wanted to give that talk. I'd submitted that talk, I think, in 2013. I submitted talks to every DConf. When IOPipe was there, I wanted to give that talk as well.
But the in-out talk was your first one, and you really wanted to give that one.
Yeah, well, I wanted to give both of those. I submitted both of them to 2016. One of the main reasons I actually ended up going to DConf is because I got accepted, because I don't think I would have been able to afford actually having everything paid for by the foundation was a key factor for me going to DConf in Berlin. But since those 2 talks were done, all the other talks that I've given, I think maybe the serialization talk is probably the first one where I was like, okay, I really want to give this talk. I think it's a great thing. The other ones are, I can give a talk. I know that it's helpful for the conference, so I'll submit one. So a lot of times it's something like that. But yeah, that's the main motivation, is just helping out the conference and trying to find some good content.
Well, I noticed that different people have different stresses or lack of stress when they're prepping for these things. Does it affect you at all in getting prepared for that?
Yes, but very much so. Like, I don't think there's a talk that I've given so far where I haven't felt like I was going to throw up like right before. I'm serious. Like, and it's not like I don't know anybody there. I know everybody in the room pretty much, but for some reason, just before my talk, I can't even function. So, but then when the talk starts happening, it's fine.
Yeah, it just all evaporates. We invited you to the monthly meetings, I guess, last year.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been with us now for a few months. How has that changed your outlook on D, or your view of D, or of the D community? I mean, I know once I started getting more involved, I was a little reluctant about posting in the forums sometimes.
I don't know, because so I've been going to the conferences pretty much every year. We've been doing, since COVID, we've been doing the online beer conf every month. I'm pretty well involved in the community, and I feel like, it's just another piece to the puzzle for me.
Well, I mean, I'm curious, because I mean, there comes a time once you start becoming a regular member of the D Foundation meetings, you're seen as part of the D Foundation, and that puts you on kind of a different side in some ways. So when you say something in the forums, people coming new to D right? Who don't have that your history. They just see you as a spokesperson for the D Foundation. You see what I mean? It's like,
yep.
Yeah. So that's why I was very reluctant to. There were a couple of times when I said something in the forums, and later I would see somebody, see, the D Foundation thinks this. I'm like, no, I think that. You know.
Right.
So I'm really reluctant to say things sometimes. You haven't encountered that yet?
I tend to. I've done a lot of posts where I type out a big long ranty post and then delete it. Just like, no, this isn't going to help anything. It's not so much that I'm worried that that I'm going to be treated as a representative of the D Language Foundation, but it's more like I just we need less of this, not more of it.
Right.
So I tend to not post rants. I tend to read them first, like a few times, and then like, maybe I shouldn't. I've definitely posted things that were a lot nastier when I first wrote them, but then I tamed it down quite a bit. So
yeah, and now you're a moderator in both the Discord and the forums, the official forums. So yeah, you can't be nasty anymore.
Now I'm now an official representative, I guess.
So we've been talking a lot about all these, open source libraries and your contributions to D, but we haven't talked so much about your usage of D professionally. So you did get D a little bit into one or two companies you worked at before, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And that motivated some of the projects that you did, like dcollections and your work with Vibe.
Yep.
But you weren't. Were you working with D full time at the company, or was that just a side? Yeah. Okay. So and now you're working with Symmetry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're working as a D programmer.
Correct.
Yes. And how does it feel to finally be a D programmer?
Yeah, no, that's really awesome. I do like that aspect of it, that I can use D in my professional career, as opposed to just doing stuff on the side.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of like the dream, right? To have your hobby be your job.
One of the big selling points of going to DConf that I don't think so many people realize is that it is an entry way into some of these D shops. I know Weka hired one of our SEOC participants straight from DConf a couple of years ago. Symmetry has hired people straight from DConf. So, well, after interviews, but yeah, that's a great way to get a D job.
So it's a great way to find people for D jobs as well. I know there's a lot of companies that it's surprising sometimes that you just like, what? There's this company doing this thing, and we've never heard of it.
We've never heard of them, and here they are. Yeah. So last thing then, what has got you most interested and excited right now, if anything, for what's coming down the pipe for D?
So we have been kind of stagnant on how we're progressing the language and how we're progressing the standard library. And I'm really excited about having the ability with additions or whatever to make new changes and new features without worrying about breaking everybody's code. So that I think is going to open a lot of good opportunities for improving the language. I'm looking forward to, I'd love to get this GC working. I think, I believe that the performance is going to be so worth it that it's like, we may end up, silencing all the complaints about how slow the GC is, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm hoping it gets to that point. I don't want to oversell it because I don't know, but it does seem like, that would be a huge win. But yeah, getting more asynchronous IO support. We have, we just added the string interpolation stuff. There's a lot of cool features coming that I think it's just going to accelerate kind of like all the new features with having the additions. So that's probably the most exciting thing I think that's happening.
And would you have any advice for wannabe contributors? I mean, you're like king of the contributors, I think. So
I don't know about that. My advice is use D for something.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to contribute, I think the easiest thing to do is say, okay, I want to try using D for this thing that I would normally use something else for. Especially if you're already familiar with other programming languages, and you will inevitably find things that need improving. And that's the easiest way to get motivated. Like I don't think I've ever made a contribution for something that I didn't personally like find a problem with. Like, whereas it's like, okay, I'll fix. It's always something that's like, okay, this should work better. I'm just going to go fix it, and that's what motivates me to do it. So I think that's the easiest way to get into it. Yeah, you'd have some good satisfaction with, okay, I fixed this and now my stuff is working better. I find that to be a really good motivator.
Well, I can say that by the time this video is published, around the time this video is published, Symmetry Autumn of Code 2024 will be announced, and I think that's a great entryway for somebody who is looking to get into the D community and maybe has an itch they want to scratch, some problem they see that you're suggesting here. You actually get paid in the Symmetry Autumn of Code to contribute. So I think that's an excellent way, but you don't have to. But yeah, it is a great way to do it. So Steve, thank you for joining me. And I appreciate you taking the time to do it.
All right. Thanks for having me, Mike.